Okay, good morning. My name is Victor Katan. I'm a senior research fellow at the Middle East Institute, and I'm delighted to introduce the first panel of this conference, which is on security and the news. We have three speakers today from the United Kingdom, Qatar, and Norway. I'll introduce each speaker in turn, and they'll have between 15 and 20 minutes to present their papers. And after everybody has spoken, I'll then open the floor for questions and answers. And I've been told to keep brutal timekeeping. The speakers, you'll see that there's a clock, and there's a panel here that will let you know how much time you have to speak. So without much further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Noha Melo, who's a professor of media and Deputy Director of the Research Institute for Media, Arts and Performance at the University of Bedfordshire. She received both her PhD and her MA from the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. And her recent publications are Reporting in the MENA Region, Cyber Engagement and Pan-Arab Social Media. That's published, it's going to be published this year. She's also the author of Egyptian Dream, Egyptian National Identity and Uprisings by Edinburgh University Press, also coming out this year. And Who Represents the Revolutionaries? Examples from the Egyptian Revolution in 2011. That was published in Mediterranean Politics. So thank you, Noah.
Okay, thank you, Victor, for the introduction. Another native Egyptian, I'm afraid. So well, I mean, just a tiny bit about myself. I'm native Egyptian, and I spent half of my life in Europe between Denmark and the UK, hence my education in Denmark. So I'm going to talk today about social media and how it was applied, but this time by journalists. I will touch upon citizen journalism, which Sahar also talked about a little bit in her keynote address. And basically, what I'm going to tell you today is based on a book that is released this year about social media and pan-Arab newsrooms, which I co-authored with a colleague from American University in Sharjah, Professor Muhammad Aish. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm short-sighted, so I have to take this off when I read. So, in significant ways, Arab journalism has never been detached from global communications transition, and more Arab media organizations are embracing digital technologies as developments in telecommunication infrastructures continue to approach global standards, especially in the oil-rich Gulf region. As elsewhere, social media in the Middle East have come to serve as new platforms for extensive virtual conversations, as Sahar mentioned in her keynote. And such conversations tend to get quite heated during crisis situations, such as the Gaza conflict in 2014. For instance, both Israel and Hamas were getting highly active on social media sites to rally support for their causes. Israel recruited hundreds of students to take part in its campaign on social media, while Hamas' Twitter account witnessed a surge in traffic during that period, with tweets in English, Hebrew, and Arabic showing distressing images of dead and injured children. Numerous hashtags appeared on Twitter as part of Hamas campaigns, such as hashtag Gaza under attack. The so-called Islamic State, ISIS or IS, provided another example of harnessing social media in conflicts within the region. An ISIS strategy of warfare in Syria and Iraq was based on using new social media to disseminate their ideas. The ISIS depended on its own media divisions to produce and disseminate online materials, producing footages glorifying the group and its mission. Today I want to focus on another aspect of the use of social media, but here focusing on journalism, on journalists and how they use social media, and narrow the focus again to pan-Arab newsrooms for different reasons. And in the newsrooms, and how they use social media, which also draws on the relation between journalism and politics in the region. The media sector across the region has also been subjected to an increasing wave of liberalization policies, coupled paradoxically with rigid media laws. Meanwhile, several media outlets have expanded their digital offerings, and a new generation of online journalists has emerged, demanding recognition as cultural guardians. Now, I'm not going to give you, because I don't have much time, so I'm not going to give you, and by the way, I can't see the clock there. So, but anyway, I'm not going to bore you with details about the historical perspective. You can read that in my previous books about Arab media. So it's a good opportunity to publicize for my books here. But very briefly from historical perspective, news in the Arab world was not a mass product as such. Rather, its main aim was to provide instructions to officials and governors, guiding them to improve their performance. And in addition to having served as a platform to communicate official messages by the political establishments, the early newspapers in the region also served as a platform to voice concerns and ambitions of Arab intellectuals inflamed by their nationalist struggle, particularly in the early 20th century. So far more important than communicating news was the delivery of views and opinions of these intellectuals who used to question their national identity and their cultural roots, particularly in places like Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Algeria. Arab journalism in the 21st century continued to embrace much of the traditional values of nationalism and mobilization despite recent uprisings and the wave of liberal market development. What contributed to the continuation of this role are the regulations across the region, which have encouraged a genuine departure from the traditional practices. The recent uprisings have strengthened rather than weakened Arab journalists' role as activists, and many journalists now do not even see any contradiction between their political involvement and the professional objectivity or standard of objectivity. I'm quoting here the editor of the Egyptian newspaper Al-Masri Al-Yawm, who defended this trend, saying, "We are no longer hiding our political agenda. We are becoming much more upfront and clear about our political stance, and our support for the revolution is becoming clearer in our editorial policy." Being the newspaper, Masri Al-Yawm, with the highest reach today, we have the tools to influence and to take part in major dialogue initiatives in the country. Generally, the main challenge facing Arab states since 2011 is how to strike a balance between reforming and liberating the pan-Arab media sector, for instance, while downplaying similar trends in the political sphere. So in this respect, the Arab region represents a rather unique case where commercialization and liberalization of selected media industries have gone hand in hand with continuous state intervention and increasing self-censorship. Now, I'm going to talk today about a study which basically based on that book I'm releasing with my colleague Aish, in which we examine the impact of social media on pan-Arab newsroom, focusing, as I said, on pan-Arab newsrooms as a case study. The analysis here, which I'm presenting here, we basically followed 10 pan-Arab media organizations listed here to see how they harness social media to expand their reach, brand names, and products, and enhance audience engagement with their content. And they include these pan-Arab news outlets. Some of them, like the BBC Arabic, Deutsche Welle in Berlin, and France 24 in Paris, are, of course, Western-based and part of well-established Western organizations. Now, the analysis draws on quantitative and qualitative data generated by following how these pan-Arab media outlets use two particular social media tools, Facebook and Twitter. Though the use of social space by pan-Arab media organizations, at least those, goes beyond these two platforms to embrace YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, and others, the huge amount of data generated from all those platforms would be too difficult to manage in one single study like ours. So we focused on and discussed the sample of pan-Arab media originated social media traffic in terms of topic and in engagement. So for quantitative part, and basically it's actually Aish who did the quantitative part. He followed, he used something called Simply Measured, where he would track the or trace the engagement of audiences following the main anchors or some main anchors in these outlets. An engagement here would comprise replies, retweets, mentions, and favorites. The analysis was also supplemented by a qualitative part, which I carried out, basically interviews with the social media editors in these target organizations. So let me start by telling you some kind of brief idea about the findings, how they used social media. Generally, we found that pan-Arab media journalists use social media in 4 distinctive ways: crowdsourcing ideas from audiences to enrich their programs, driving traffic to their own organizations, central websites or portals, sharing links with audiences, and making personal statements on issues and events in the region. But I have to say here that not all of them made such personal statements. I'll come to that shortly. We found that journalists working for the 2 kind of ideologically oriented channels, Al Jazeera and Mayadeen in particular, were active in using social media in the 4 patterns I mentioned, with a noticeable emphasis on what we called advocacy or advocacy facets of the social media traffic. We found that journalists had varying levels of engagement with audiences as based on their Facebook posts or Twitter or tweets. Al Jazeera's journalists like Faisal Al-Qasim, who presents opposite direction, الاتجاه المعاكس, or الاتجاه المعاكس as other Arabs would call it. Now I'm Egyptian, I can't say ja. Al Jazeera's journalists came at the forefront in terms of engagement, mainly because the topics they post carry huge potential controversies and were bound to generate highly sensational feedbacks. On the other hand, journalists and other media outlets were receiving lower engagement due to the less dramatic nature of their posted topics. Some outlets like BBC Arabic, which is part of BBC World Service, and Deutsche Welle in Berlin do not usually allow the journalists to express the personal. Well, I have to say they do not at all allow the journalists, particularly in the BBC, to express their personal and political views online. In contrast to other Arab-speaking media outlets like Al Jazeera allow their journalists to use social media to express their views, even if they end up venting their problems on social media. One example that we mentioned in the book was Faisal Al-Qasim, but I can also tell you about another example, which is the tweets of Ahmed Mansour, who is also a veteran host at Al Jazeera Arabic. His tweets have been followed closely by a number of Egyptian media outlets who accused Mansour of using social media to incite public opinion against the Egyptian army and against President Sisi. One example was a Facebook post published in February 2014 and was claimed to belong to Mansour. Was it this one? Maybe not this one, but it's another example of Mansour's tweets. But that one was a Facebook post, not a tweet by Mansour. And it was claimed that it belonged to him, in which there was explicit incitement to kill Egyptian security forces, officers. And Mansour immediately denied that he owned a Facebook account in the first place. He said he owns only a Twitter account. So he immediately denied that he is the one who posted that Facebook post. So it's a long story you mentioned also in the book, but it ended up with several mainstream Egyptian media, such as Al-Yom Seba, newspaper in Egypt, launching an offensive on Mansour and casting doubt on his motives in writing such a post. And some anchors in Egypt demanded the revocation of Mansour's Egyptian citizenship as a penalty for his Facebook post. Pan-Arab journalists' Facebook posts have varied according to their individual professional and ideological orientation. Of course, audiences determine the popularity of those posts, but since those journalists originally initiated those posts, they in significant way reflected their political and ideological preferences. An audience engagement with such posts and tweets in no way suggests positive approval of social content initiated by the journalist. In many cases, it shows a divisive issue that is creating a good deal of negative buzz that might be detrimental to the journalists who had originally initiated the content online. All in all, two categories of social media users have been identified here: the advocacy journalism, or what we call advocacy journalism, and the professional journalism users. Advocacy journalism would be people who would use it to state clear political and ideological inclinations or promote certain ideological stance, and the professional one would adhere or try to adhere to Western Anglo-American, basically, standards of objectivity and neutrality. This doesn't suggest at all that media in the advocacy category, like Al Jazeera or Mayadeen, have no guidelines for social media work. Of course they do, but at the same time, their engagement with audiences as voices of the same ideology of the organization doesn't seem to be discouraged. Now, there are many things I can tell you from the book, but maybe I have to hurry here. But there was something about, for instance, using social media to know what's happening or the trends out there, like the social media unit at the BBC Arabic service has started a blog called BBC Trends, which is also there in the English website. So the Arabic service kind of replicated the same idea. So they have their own BBC Trends, which reviews the most, kind of a press review, according to the social media editor there. He said they review the most popular topics, but dedicated to social media trends, and it feeds into mainstream television and radio departments. And that trend report is useful to a group of audiences, according to them, who do not have time to review all social media sites. 2 minutes? You're kidding. We have to hurry then. But there are many really good points. But yeah, I wanted to tell you about news values because we noticed a big difference in. Sorry? Have you extended my talk? Oh, 1 more minute. Well, okay, but there are actually, very important things. Like, it's evident from talking to social media editors in these selected outlets that social media sites have helped change the rigid news values that traditionally favored hard political news, and now they're talking more about soft news or light news, particularly on Facebook, more than Twitter. Because Facebook basically depended on using visuals as well and images. Like the BBC editor was telling me that, and also happened in Deutsche Welle, where they told me that it was enough to post an image, let's say, of Big Ben in London to initiate a discussion or a chat on Facebook, engaging with audiences somehow. Of course, it was also used for news gathering, and one vivid example, my favorite example of how newsrooms used this story, it was a story from Al Hayat newspaper from their main office in Beirut. And the one who broke this newspaper called Fatma Rida, who's also the online and social media editor there. And she posted an article on 21st of May 2014 about this group on social media. The group is about female Syrian refugees available for marriage, and it had more than 15,000 likes. She wrote about the group, she interviewed relevant agencies, and she told me that without social media she wouldn't be able to find out about this news. Now the group was, she told me that after publishing the article, the group disappeared, only to be relaunched again shortly under a different name. The article triggered reactions of human rights organizations in Lebanon to question marriages of Syrian minors, and also triggered a wave of insults against the creators of the page, casting doubt about their real intention. Well, two more things, but I don't know if I have time to say them, but about moderation, because the social media editors I talked to, they told me that they struggle with the moderation, because moderation here constitutes an important feature of online journalism, although it's also a paradox in the liberating effect of social and new media that you have to moderate. But all the social media editors I talked to complained about the wave of using social media by audiences to basically insult others. And the trick is, and this I talk about more in the book, is how audiences, for instance, in Morocco, would post something in the vernacular, in Moroccan Arabic, for an editor coming from Lebanon. It might be difficult to understand. Now, you always underestimate, as scholars, you always underestimate the issue of language, but for me, maybe because I studied linguistics, I think it's absolutely important. And when it comes to moderation, this is a huge headache for these newsrooms, I bet for all newsrooms, because if audiences post in a dialect that's not particularly intelligible to others, to the editor or to the journalist, then that is a problem. Of course, they try to moderate by filtering, use certain words to filter the content, because it's very difficult to delete posts from Facebook. The issue of citizen journalism, which of course I bet you wonder about it, and Sahar mentioned, but of course it has transformed the Arab media scene, as Sahar mentioned as well, and with a Syrian example that she drew on. In fact, one recent study shows that nearly 60% of those following the situation in Syria do not trust news and footage broadcast by state television, unsurprisingly, while they 100% endorse the need for citizen journalism to tell the world what was really happening there. On the other hand, citizen journalism raises a challenge for all social media editors I talk to, the challenge of verification of material sent by audiences, because not all visuals or information sent by citizen journalism is necessarily true. Could be also fake. So, yes, the future of social media holds good promise for Pan-Arab media, and the development of new social measurements and analytics would hugely help those media to engage with their audiences across the region. But I would like you all to read more about this topic in my new book, Reporting in the MENA Region, Cyber Engagement, Pan-Arab Social Media, authored by myself and Mohammed Aish. Released in a couple of months. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Suzy Madani, and she'll be giving a presentation on tweeting, terrorism, information and communication technology, and media spectacles. Suzy Madani is manager and editor for publications at the Center for International and Regional Studies, Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar. She received her PhD in Communication and Media Studies from the Eastern Mediterranean University, and she's co-edited Food Security in the Middle East by Oxford University Press, Bullets and Bulletins, Media and Politics in the Wake of the Arab Uprisings by Hearst, which is forthcoming. Madani is also an independent filmmaker and a writer and director of several short films, including Hind's Dream, which was selected for the Short Film Corner at 2015 Cannes Film Festival. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm going to break the cycle. I am not Egyptian. So this presentation is part of a larger study I'm conducting on Al-Shabaab's 4-day attack on the Westgate Mall in Nairobi in 2013, in which 70 people died, including the 4 terrorists themselves. Now, the attack was mediated through a variety of networks and social media platforms, especially Twitter. Now, Twitter was used as the main source of communication between everyone that was involved in the attack, including the terrorists, the victims, government officials, the media, and local and international publics. Now, Westgate is very interesting as a case study because it shows how media networks and extremists both played a role in creating a spectacle of terrorism. Now, because of the ubiquity of ICTs, information and communication technologies, and over 100 security cameras located throughout the mall, we have an extraordinary array of visual material that emerged from this attack. And it all served to fuel corporate network competition and, obviously, their audience share and advertising revenue. In this instance, the violence of the terrorist attack was appropriated by both Al-Shabaab and the media, making the relationship a kind of symbiosis. Here, the supposedly oppositional ideologies were able to communicate directly with one another through the language of publicity and marketing. There was a time when terrorists really had to court the media, the traditional newspapers, and so on, for their message to be sent out. And we have an example of way back in 1996, bin Laden's fatwa or declaration of war was faxed to newspapers, hoping that it would be picked up. In one instance, Peter Arnett from CNN asks bin Laden, "What are your future plans?" And bin Laden says, "You will see them and hear about them in the media, God willing," or presumably he said, "Inshallah." So, as you can see, extremists no longer need the necessary permissions from editors and network owners. This is an example of an app that is made by ISIS and placed on Google Play, in which it is free to download. It is obviously no longer the case, but they created and uploaded this app, and it's like a tweet channeling app. So it's able to actually take ISIS's tweets and channel it directly to a supporter's mobile phone. And in one instance, it channeled 40,000 tweets in one day. Obviously, this was taken down, but there are other instances in which authorities do not remove social media accounts, and this is to actually gather information and to monitor them. So we have an extraordinary situation where those who are most vehemently opposing terrorism and terrorist activities are friending, liking, and following these social media accounts, therefore bumping up their audience share as well. Now, the use of Twitter during Westgate shows a reversal of the traditional roles of audiences or users and the media. Twitter users, in the case of Westgate, not only reported breaking news, but they were the source of breaking news. So, for example, we just have a few tweets here from the Westgate incident. The first tweet to actually talk about the shootings was someone from outside the mall who had heard gunshots and explosions. The second is from within the mall, someone who is actually there experiencing the attack. And then the next two is where we see our traditional need for the media to inform us about what's going on. So as you can see there, they're asking for news, and they're asking news networks for more news. So about half an hour later, after the first tweet, we get finally a tweet from the government, in which case the Disaster Operations Center, this is one of the Kenyan government departments, writes back half an hour later. The next one we have over there, K24 TV, that's a local news station. That comes about 40 minutes after the first tweet. The third one here is an international news organization. This comes about 45 minutes after the initial tweet. And then just to give you a little bit of background, all the Kenyan government departments went onto Twitter about 10 days before the attack. So there was a lot of immaturity in the way, or amateur manner in which they used the application. So for example, the Interior Ministry here asks the Kenyan Defense Forces to follow it back publicly. So comparing that to the very savvy way in which Al-Shabaab live tweeted the events from the beginning of the incident. So they claimed responsibility. Now Peter Bergen tells us that this is actually the first instance ever that we have of a terrorist organization claiming responsibility through social media, through Twitter. And the next is justifications. They sent hundreds of tweets. Every hour there were many tweets in which they justified their positions. So they're actually using the platform of Twitter to oppose official narratives and to give their own narratives. In which case they call themselves the Mujahideen, they call themselves the Westgate Warriors. They imbue themselves with a sense of heroism and protagonism. And then the last, they're actually using the language of the media. As you can see, I don't know if you can see, but breaking news and stay tuned. These are the kind of language usually used in media. A little bit more on the type of language used by Al-Shabaab during this incident. I don't know if you can read that, but I will read the first one to you because it's kind of interesting. It says, "Here are two of the Mujahideen inside hashtag Westgate Mall, unruffled and strolling around the mall in such sang-froid manner." Now, I admit I had to look up the word sang-froid, which turns out not to be sang-froid at all. It's sang-froid, and it's a French word meaning cold-blooded or cool, calm, and collected. And then the next one, we have words like paradigm shift. I mean, these are words that we are all very familiar with in academia, and you wouldn't necessarily think that a terrorist would use those words, but just as I was putting together my thesis on the beauty of language, you get the third one here. I don't know if you can see that. So they used multiple Twitter accounts, and every time they opened an account and were discovered, it was shut down. So they used a total of 5 Twitter handles. Each time one of these was shut down. So it's actually very difficult to know the timing of all of these tweets. However, every time they got shut down, they'd say, "We're shut down, but we're back." And this isn't necessarily something to do with their dexterity, but it's something to do with Twitter as a medium, and it allows for anonymity, and it allows for multiple people to open multiple accounts. And in the last one, it just shows that relationship between terrorists and journalists, and it says, "Our email address has changed, we'll send you a new one." So just comparing the tweets of the terrorists versus the tweets of the authorities, there was an inordinate amount of voices from every which way via Twitter, and the Kenyan government attempted to control this narrative, which was near impossible. So every time someone would take a photograph and upload it online, photograph of soldiers, helicopters, and so on, the Kenyan government would say, "Delete it," or "take it down," and it would be further circulated. So it just shows this amateur nature of the relationship between the authorities and the social media platform. So even as the Kenyan government was asking others to stop circulating misinformation, they themselves were involved in the circulation of misinformation. And one of them here, I don't know if you can see that properly, but the legend says that there were 12 attackers, where in reality what we know from watching the CCTV cameras is that there were only 4. Now, this was obviously bumped up for a reason, and the reason was to get more security and more surveillance. So it took, so another one of the misinformation was that the Kenyan government released a statement saying that Samantha Lethwaite was part of the attacks. Now, Samantha Lethwaite, also known as the Black Widow, was the widow of one of the London suicide bombers. Now, they said that she was part of the Al-Shabaab terrorists, which she wasn't. So it took Al-Shabaab to actually refute these accusations. And they came on Twitter and they said, "We do not use our sisters in jihad." Here's another example of direct communication with terrorists. This is the Twitter account of the Department of Security, I believe, US Department of Security, and a terrorism supporter. And as you can see, there is a direct dialogue going on. So the idea of no longer communicating with terrorists cannot be sustained in the age of social media. Here's another example of the Al-Shabaab terrorists watching the news and then responding. So they're actually saying here, yes, we confirm that these two people are part of our organization. So news media and entertainment media are being shaped by the same marketing principles, making their products similar in style and substance. Terrorist organizations similarly emulate entertaining and professional media productions. Media literacy and sharing of codes of popular culture is a symptom of ICT-saturated environment. So here we have the 4-day attack was presented on all of the news networks as an evolving reality television saga. And here we see the moment that customers are transformed into victims of a terrorist attack. And this was repeated over and over. And then as we get more incidences, these are added as well. So for example, audiences were taken behind the scenes. These are all from CCTV cameras. This is behind the scenes. This is when the Al-Shabaab terrorists went into a back room, a storeroom in the mall, and they spent hours there chatting, idling, sleeping, and as you can see here, taking turns to pray. So using social media, terrorists generate their own realities, whether through Twitter or just moving on to something that is evolving from just going back to reality television, this is as if this saga didn't need any more drama. Here we have CCTV capturing the Kenyan soldiers stealing from the mall as well. So, using social media, terrorists generate their own social realities, whether through Twitter or by recording firsthand footage using GoPro-style cameras. And we saw that most recently with the Virginia shooting. So basically, this kind of point-of-view camera, audiences are positioned as the shooter, seeing what the attacker sees and doing what the attacker does in a similar subjective perspective used to first-person video games. So in a similar way, it's a common reaction. Now I'm talking about how terrorists are also media literate and using the same grammar of film and television and popular culture. So a common reaction to watching these images on the news is to associate it with the fiction of film. And there's a very famous example of when the Twin Towers fell, and Robert De Niro was actually looking at them from his New York apartment, but he couldn't believe his eyes, so he had to turn on the television to watch the news to actually confirm what he was seeing. So we actually get this situation where the media is shaping our preferences. But further than that, we go to, this is going back to film. This is the Westgate attack as seen and narrated by the Al-Shabaab terrorists. So they made their own documentary to counter any of the other documentaries that were out there. And just talking a little bit more about how there is a shared commodification of terror and how there is a shared interest in prolonging the spectacle of terror, whether on the side of the terrorists or on the side of the media. And as you can see, there's the Al Hayat Media Center, which is ISIS's media center, and it directly emulates the Al Jazeera logo over there. Here we have Je suis Charlie Hebdo, the Charlie Hebdo attacks. These are Je suis Charlie t-shirts, which were immediately commodified in the post-atrocity. And here we have, obviously, ISIS's brand. So we're all heading towards a similar kind of commodification of terror in this instance. I don't know if I'm out of time, but... Yes, 15 seconds. So I'm just talking about how terror is commodified, and in these images, these are the images that we saw of the incident. There is a complete defamiliarization of space. So this isn't what we would normally associate with the space of the malls. But however, I do want to say that this isn't new to us. We also have another complete defamiliarization, which is when I see photographs of the Westgate attack and the Rana Plaza collapse of a building, which is a garment factory in Bangladesh that is used to make many of the well-known brands. I see a lot of similarities between international terrorism and international capitalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzy. Our next and final speaker today is Lars Haugom, and he'll be speaking on media and the armed forces in Turkey. Lars Haugom is a visiting scholar at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies in Oslo. He is currently working on a PhD project on changes in civil-military relations in Turkey since 2000. And he holds a Candidatus Rerum Politicarum in Political Science from the University of Oslo, and has more than 15 years of experience in teaching, analysis, and directing analytical work in the Middle East for the Norwegian Armed Forces. Thank you, Lars.
As you are, of course, all aware, the military has been an important political actor in Turkey since the founding of the modern republic in 1923, and has played a decisive role in the shaping of the political course of the country, both from behind the scenes and by direct intervention in the government. However, civil-military relations in Turkey have undergone substantial changes over the last 2 decades, in particular since the Justice and Development Party, AKP, came to power in 2002. Even if the armed forces have kept much of its institutional autonomy, political, institutional, and constitutional reforms have curbed the powers of the military to influence the government decision-making process. In short, what we have seen is civilianization of civil-military ties, seriously questioning the traditional guardianship role of the military in Turkish politics. And I think that civilianization is maybe best illustrated by this photo, where the then Prime Minister and now President Erdogan is going in front of the military top brass. The role of the media in civil-military relations have so far received limited attention, both in the general literature and in the case study of Turkey. So the purpose of my paper for this conference is to examine the development of military media relations in Turkey, and against this background discuss the role that the media have played in Turkish civil-military relations. Just a few words about the field of civil-military relations, which in most cases hopefully are more cordial than this cartoon suggests. In my paper, I touch briefly on the theoretical approaches to the field, from the functional separation approach, emphasizing clear separation of the civilian and military fields, and distinct civilian authority of the armed forces, of criticism of this theory for being both outdated and having a Western bias, to the alternative, to an alternative theoretical model in the works of, for example, Rebecca Schiff and Douglas Bland, emphasizing civil-military relations as a cooperative effort between different actors. For example, in the case of Turkey, by using Schiff and Bland in a slightly modified form, we can see civil-military relations as a cooperative effort between the military leadership, the political leadership, the citizenry, and external partners, deciding which principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures should be for civil-military relations. The question is, where is the media in all of this? One of the scholars who have touched upon this is Charles Moskos in his work on the postmodern military, where military media relations is one of the variables that is using as a criteria for the postmodern military. According to Moskos, the role of the civilian media has developed from being incorporated and censored during what he calls the modern period, that is before 1945, to controlled and manipulated during the late modern and then to the post-modern period, where the media is actually courted by the military. Moskos also says that, of course, these changes do not just happen between the military and the media, but should be seen as a reflection of wider changes in post-industrial society. This also leads us to a question of causality when we want to study the role of the media in civil-military relations. Is it the media affecting civil-military relations, or is it in fact the configuration of civil-military relations influencing the media, or is both the media and civil-military relations affected by macro scale changes in society? Now, turning to Turkey, we can say that the media has provided one of the important links between the military and the population, and the bond between the military and the population in Turkey has been described as a strong bond of almost mythical proportions. We can say that in Turkish civil-military relations, the media has constituted a two-way channel of communication between the military leadership and the citizenry. Media actors follow closely the opinions, decisions, and actions of the military, and give military and security issues wide coverage. Correspondingly, the media regularly search out public opinion on the military, thereby functioning as a censor for the military leadership to measure the standing of the armed forces in the population. If we look at the situation since the late 1990s, there have been two major developments in military media relations in Turkey. From the military side, we can say that the military has gone from using the media primarily as a means of informing and controlling society to using the media to convince society of its point of view and to seek legitimacy for its actions. We could see this for the first time during the so-called soft coup in 1997, where the military had what can best be described as a media campaign to convince society of the necessity to remove the civilian government. We could also see a similar pattern when the military published its so-called E memorandum in 2007. This was widely seen as a coup attempt by the military. However, the interesting point is that the military chose to publish the memorandum on its web page. It seems like in 1997 that the military sought to convince the citizenry of its point of view, and to mobilize society against the government. The second major change in military media relations is in the attitude of the media towards the military, which has gone from the generally respectful and supportive to the more critical and questioning. We can say that from the turn of the millennium, the Turkish military has come under increasing scrutiny from various media actors, and that a new type of critical and questioning coverage of military and security issues has become more common. Examples of such reporting can be found both in the media coverage of certain security incidents in the southeast, and in the media's coverage to the large-scale legal processes like the Ergenekon and the Balios. Two liberal left publications, the weekly Nokta and the daily Taraf, spearheaded this development with a highly critical and accusatory style. However, the tendency towards a more bold and critical reporting can also be seen in the coverage of the secular mainstream and in the pro-government media. Now, how can we explain these changes? And I will have to do this briefly, since I see that I am also running out of time. I argue in my paper that the first factor that we have to look to is the commercialization of the media sector in Turkey, which followed from structural reforms of the Turkish economy from the mid to late 1980s. The number of media actors multiplied as a result of commercialization, and the source of news and entertainment became more diverse. Moreover, commercialization led to a concentration of media ownership in a handful of private business conglomerates. What primarily attracted the business interests was revenue from advertising, in particular from TV commercials. And the new owners' focus on generating revenues affected the journalistic profile in the media, resulting in an increase of the tabloidization and a more sensationalist reporting. This had several consequences for military media relations. You got more and more diverse news sources, making more difficult for the military to control or manipulate the flow of information to the public. The diversification of the media also exposed media audiences to different points of view concerning, for example, security issues, and the more sensationalist style of reporting shifted media focus more to spectacular incidents, also involving the military. This placed the Turkish military under a type of scrutiny that it had not experienced before. However, commercialization in itself cannot explain the more critical reporting in the media. So I argue that we also have to add a more permissive media environment. This does not amount to greater media freedom as such, but rather meant that many sensitive issues that were previously considered taboo became more open for debate. This included questions such as the role of religion in state and society, conditions for the Kurdish minority, and also the role and the conduct of the armed forces. And then a final factor, as has been mentioned many times today, online media, especially social media, played a role. And social media platforms has been used extensively for leveling criticism against the military. So we can say that we see development in many ways similar to the one outlined by Moscow's. Censorship and manipulation has given way to the Turkish armed forces interacting more with the media. And then if we look at the role of the media in civil-military relations, we can say that before the 1990s, the media seems to have, to a great extent, been influenced by civil-military relations, while since the end of the 1990s, it has rather been the case that the media has been more of a driving force for civilization by placing the military under great scrutiny. And there I think I will have to end.
Thank you very much. That would be great. Thank you. James, please.
I'm James Dorsey, Professor Ruffin, School of International Studies. Particularly, I wanted to ask Suzy. You mentioned the notion of the gatecrashers versus the gatekeepers, and it strikes me that if there has been really one fundamental shift in as a result of advancements in ICT, it's been exactly that. That the role of the gatekeeper. Sorry. Okay. That the role of the gatekeeper, both in terms of what is determining news, in terms of distribution of news, and in terms of sourcing, has, if you wish, democratized the field. And then the question becomes what you described in the Westgate Mall case, in a sense, at the end with the comparison to the Rana Plaza. What makes the interaction between perpetrators of political violence in this kind of situation, in terms of social media, any different than what is actually happening on the internet with any single issue you would want to choose?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're exactly right. Twitter and social media platforms, as you've said, have democratized the idea of anyone with something to say can say it. But ultimately, these social media platforms are businesses, right? So the overarching structure is one of a corporate capitalist business, even though those within, those users are able to use it for alternative means. So it actually took Twitter a very long time to shut down those accounts because they didn't want to, even though they knew that these were known terrorist accounts, but they're a business. And if it's shut for one person, it can be shut for another reason as well. So, but I see what you're saying, you're absolutely right.
Fahad, you got a question?
Hi, thanks. Fadl Smith from the Gulf University for Science and Technology in Kuwait. I have two kind of comparative questions, I guess, one for Noha and one for Suzy. Noha, I'm curious about the relationship. You're talking about sort of the rise in almost freedoms of online media, or at least in their tenacity to say things. But post-uprisings, we also saw a decline in especially mass media. For example, in Egypt, there was a burgeoning of media, and then it sort of constricted quite a bit. We have no more Bassam Yousefs, for example. And then in the Gulf region where I live, social media, there's been a heavy crackdown on that post-uprisings with the governments trying to quell dissent. Al Jazeera's credibility came into severe question post-uprising. So I'm wondering how you see the sort of the more tenacious forms of social media you talked about, the pan-Arab media. Why are they more vocal now when so many other forms of media are declining, if you have any thoughts about that? And for Suzy, I just wonder if you've had the opportunity yet to start looking at the relationship between how Al-Shabaab has used social media versus like Al-Qaeda and its various affiliates, or IS. I mean, there's a lot of focus now on IS and, of course, Al-Qaeda originally. And I'd just be curious to hear if you've looked at these.
Yeah, about the uprising. Well, actually, ironically, the uprisings were, let's say in Egypt, for instance, was the reason why mainstream media like Al-Masri Al-Yawm newspaper, which is, they say they are the largest now in Egypt, and they had been even before 2011. It was the uprising 2011 that made them take social media seriously and actually hire some of the activists as what they call citizen journalists. But actually they hired them, they give them titles like social media, whatever, producer, whatever. They give them nice, fancy titles. And they hire them amongst the so-called activists. But basically they have many followers, or they used to have many followers on Twitter, and that's why they think they must be good for my business. But they took it as a business, from business perspective or for business reasons, like Al-Masri Al-Yawm. They didn't take it seriously in the beginning. They thought we just kind of replicate what others do. But then they found out that SMS messages, for instance, generate profit for them. So they were interested in the new media in order to kind of generate not only visibility but also profit. Yeah, I take your point about the, you said why Arab media would be vocal now. But as I mentioned, there were kind of, maybe it's kind of binary things to say they were activism or advocacy journalism versus professional journalism. It's not, of course, kind of clearly defined as such on the ground, but there were many journalists who have always been vocal, like Ahmed Mansour at Al Jazeera. I mean, who doesn't know that Ahmed Mansour is a supporter of the Brotherhood, if not a member? Faisal Qasim has always been vocal about what's happening in Syria. In fact, the tweets analyzed by my colleague Aish of Faisal Qasim dealt more with Syrian issues than Egyptian issue, given that Faisal is, of course, Syrian himself. Yeah, so I don't know if that's enough, but basically journalists here would be vocal about political issues. You can call it political agenda. They have their own agenda, which match or kind of align with the agenda maybe of their outlets. And they were encouraged in a way to express these views, while other journalists, let's say in the BBC Arabic, they have clear policy, you do not publish. And it doesn't only apply to Arab journalists in BBC Arabic, it applies to all journalists in the BBC. Now that I worked in the BBC myself before, I know that they said, you support David Cameron, you support Ed Miliband, you don't say that on your personal Facebook or Twitter account. You are not allowed to express any personal view as a BBC journalist. And it doesn't matter if you work in the Arabic or Persian or English service. And that's their policy and applies to everyone, editor or producer or anybody. Because even if it's your personal account, you're still affiliated somehow to the BBC. This is how they look at it. So I wouldn't say they are, in this term, they are more professional than Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera has also social media code. But as I said, some journalists or more visible like Al-Qasim or Mansour were allowed to express their personal views in this sense and be more vocal.
Just about your question now, I haven't done any great comparative research between the different terrorist organizations and how they use social media. But the one connection that I will say is that English. A lot of them will use the English language even though they are not the places that they're situated in, whether it's Syria or whether it's the Taliban in Afghanistan and so on. They will use English, which just shows their connection for trying to get their message out internationally. And especially in the case of the Taliban, it's about talking directly to occupiers. So I would say just the English language or other languages even, other international languages.
Thank you. Clements had a question.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Lars a question. I appreciated your paper. I'm just wondering if you could push the analysis a little bit further, given the commercialization of Turkish journalism, given the relative economic clout still of, let us say, the more pro-secular classes in Turkish society. TÜSİAD, I think, still trumps MÜSİAD. Would you see the military, which also stands for secular values, having basically an interest and possibility of better press relations than their potential, the people who put them aside?
I think that there is, of course, a difference between the different media outlets in Turkey. I mean, Nokta and Taraf, they are not representative. I think the big problem for the military has been that they have lost many of their previous allies. You mentioned TÜSİAD, for example. If we go back to the early 2000s, TÜSİAD in many ways joined the government, so to speak, because of the government's pro-European Union politics. So for a long time, the military became more or less isolated. I can't say that we have seen a great change of that. Remember that the court cases against the military officers, they went on more or less until the end of March this year, when the cases were cancelled by the courts. So I think the big problem for the military has been that they have been more or less isolated from their previous allies. What will be very interesting to see now is how the media coverage will be when there again is a more prominent role for the military. But I think that it remains to be seen. I don't know if that answered your question or.
I think it's a difficult question because Turkey is very.
It is changing all the time. It is a very, very dynamic situation still.
Basically, the possibility of the military regaining some of its allies, both the economic ones, TÜSİAD, and more of the press, given the evolution in the other direction
Yes.
of the existing government.
I think there is a possibility for that also because there is a change inside the military. If you look at the attitude of the military today, it is still a very secular institution. They have kept, at least ideologically, their guardianship role, but increasingly they seem to see this as a shared responsibility with the population. So I believe at least for the medium term future, we will not under any circumstances see a more interventionist military, and this I think brings the military much more into line with the other forces in Turkish society, including the secular press.
Thank you, Lars. The gentleman in the blue shirt.
This is Gökhan from Singapore Turkey Business Association. Thank you very much. The condition in Turkey is quite dynamic, as we've seen, and from your presentation we can understand that there is a pressure from military for some time towards media in Turkey. But currently we see a different setting as well. 2 days ago, a search warrant has been given to police with a big police army. One of the main groups in Turkey, İpek group, has been, I can say, attacked. And the other Sözcü group, and some together with them, has given empty columns for the whole day, just protesting the pressure coming from the government. We know that there is a shift from military pressure towards the civilian democracy, but this has been ironically changed into an civilian autocracy. There's an authoritarianism now going on very forcefully. They have even a social media army, which initially said to be 6,000 in force, with having spatial areas, paid people from the government resources, and now it comes to 10,000. They are called trolls, AKP, the government trolls, and they are attacking anybody who are trying to do something in the social media. So the livelihood of the social media for the opposition or for any ideas in democracy has been suppressed effectively. So can we see now military pressure transforming into a civilian authoritarianism in media power relations in Turkey? So civilian power is a power. So can we say that, conclude that?
I think I want to go back to one of the points that I made, that during the 2000s we saw a more permissive media environment, but permissive not because media freedom was extended, but because it was something that political authorities allowed. What we have seen is that when the government wants to put pressure on the media, they will use different means to pressure their business interests. So I think you are right that Turkey is taking a more authoritarian turn, this time concentrated in the executive branch of the government, and that they are definitely using their power over the media to do this. And one of the reasons why you got so much negative press for the military during the 2000s was because the government allowed it. That was one of the reasons.
So any other questions, maybe from the ladies in the audience? No? Okay. All right, the man here.
Says I look like one. I'm Dale Hudson from NYU Abu Dhabi. I have a question for everyone as well as for Sahar Kamas. I appreciate all the papers on the use of social media, and I was wondering if any of you have done any research on if this in fact exists, which it must. Activist groups as well as terrorist groups that use SMS apps rather, that don't use mobile networks, so they can't be monitored by corporations or by the states, and what has been the use of them through these other networks that can't be aggregated, collected, used as evidence for whichever side? Thanks.
Although I haven't published anything as such about this particular point, but I just want to say that there is something very important about the role of social media in general in the so-called activism. If you all share the same definition of activism, that's a different issue. But I mean, activists, like let's say the Egyptian case, they do not necessarily use social media in order to. I mean, one reason, of course, to avoid censorship, state censorship, but they had a more important reason for them, which is to reach to people in the West, if you want, or people, yeah, in different countries. So hence there were many tweets in English and Facebook posts in English. I mean, one important rationale for using social media for them is visibility. So yes, of course, there would be activists who might be using apps and so on in order to avoid state censorship, but actually many of them want to be visible because for them protection comes from the West, from USA particularly, rather than the EU, but they want to attract attention and visibility. And some of them are also receive kind of funding. I wouldn't say they are funded in order to do uprising, of course not, but I mean, they receive funding from civil society actors in Europe. So they also have to kind of justify, it's part of their work to justify the funding, so they have to be visible. So not all of them actually, I would argue that the majority of them would like to be visible rather than using apps and be invisible.
I think the Egyptian case is important in this issue.
Yeah, to answer your question, I have not done research myself on this, but I was approached recently by a researcher who is doing research on exactly what you just talked about now. And he interviewed me for his own study, which he's conducting, and he hopes to publish as his dissertation. Although, because it has some security-related issues, I think that it might have some restrictions on its publication, at least initially. But what stunned me was, in fact, the fact that he is talking about the development of certain apps that can very much be ghost-like, that can really be, beyond any kind of government detection. And my initial gut reaction was, well, this can really be a double-edged sword. Because on one hand, it can help the protesters or activists, right? If they want to escape things like being traced by the authorities, you cannot trace their IP addresses, and therefore you cannot really find out who they are, and therefore crack down on them, arrest them, or even kill them, as has been the case in some extreme cases like the Libyan activist. I don't know if you know the case, but he has been using his Skype account, really, in order to spread messages against Gaddafi during the Libyan uprising. And the Libyan authorities were able to trace his IP address and therefore identify his location, and they stormed into his apartment while he was actually online spreading one of his messages defying Gaddafi, and they killed him right inside his apartment. And his wife came online and she said to the whole world, I'm very sad, I'm shocked, I'm devastated, I'm telling you that the Gaddafi forces just stormed our apartment and they just killed my husband. So you can imagine how dramatic that is, because they were able to track his IP address and find out where he is. So in a way, having these kinds of applications can be a protection for some of the activists and protesters to defy some of the government crackdowns. But think about it the other way also. What if some of these newly developed apps, applications and programs and so on, that really are very much ghost-like and are beyond detection, fall in the wrong hands? I'm not, by any stretch of imagination, a security expert, but that was my gut reaction. So I told him, what if these kinds of applications fall in the wrong hands? In other words, in the hands of some of the extremist, radical, or terrorist groups? Then this can be potentially very dangerous for sure, because then you will not be able to find out who is sending what from where, and that in itself can pose a big security threat. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting work that I think is emerging or starting to be conducted in this area, which can pose new questions for us as researchers and academics studying this particular area, to think about the double-edged sword of such types of programs and applications, and what can happen if they're used by protesters for good causes, but what can also happen if they fall in the wrong hands of terrorists or extremists who can then defy any kind of detection or any kind of tracing. But I just want to also quickly highlight the importance of some of the interestingly visible appearances of some of these most extreme and radical groups on social media and new media, which is really amazing. Like, you know, some of the ISIS groups, you know, people have been using social media and new media in a very bold and very visible way, you know, talking about their daily lives and showing themselves with cats and, you know, just mundane everyday life kinds of things. And, you know, there were some of the people who they're trying to recruit. They send them questions, you know, are the bathrooms clean over there? Yeah, sure, but they're not clean all by themselves. We all have to clean them together. So yeah, things like that, you know, like very, very mundane, detailed, day-to-day life questions. And they're answering these types of questions that come their way, and they send the feedback. So it raises all sorts of questions about the degree of visibility that, you know, you both, I think, touched upon this point, which is very, very interesting, very paradoxical, that on one hand, hey, you know, this is a terrorist group. You would think that they really want to be, you know, out in the dark and that they don't want to attract attention. But on the other hand, they're having all of these visible appearances and interactions on social media that are sometimes very shocking because they're very, you know, very detailed, very specific, touching upon the daily, day-to-day life interactions in a way which is absolutely amazing. It raises all sorts of questions about the degree to which do you want to be visible and the degree to which do you want to be invisible and why.
There's an incident that combines both SMS apps and more visible social media apps. And it's a hoax that happened last year called the Columbia Chemicals hoax. So I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but it happened on September 11th, and it was supposedly by ISIS. So there was an attack, and it went all through social media in this one neighborhood of, I'm not entirely sure where, but somewhere in America. They woke up to SMSs saying that an attack had taken place. So, and they used it both SMS apps and social media apps as well.
Thank you, Suzy, Sahar, and the rest of the panel. I think we can continue maybe these discussions afterwards. I'm sure many of you are hungry. So many thanks to everyone who spoke today.